Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it on a morning like this. And I have to admit that yesterday when I was racing home at 5:45 from after a really difficult day with hard HR issues in a startup and going to take over responsibility for my 15-month-old twins who have just learned to climb. So hanging out with them is like being in this constant state of alarm, trying to prevent them from falling on their face and breaking their teeth. And I got a message from Mark, one of the wonderful organizers behind Creative Mornings, saying that there was 400 people on the waiting list, and I hadn't quite figured out what I was going to say to you guys. The topic seemed pretty real. So, so I thought that I would start. Here are my twins. If we're going to get real about anxiety at 9 o'clock in the morning, at least, unlike Mark, who just dove into reconciliation with no warning, I'm going to give you my baby twins to look at while we're doing that for a little while I'm talking about it. So let's start. Who in this room right now is sharing some of my feeling of anxiety right now, as a show of hands? Okay, who in this room is feeling so much anxiety that they can't even put up their hands? Okay, that's all right. You don't have to do that. We can do that later. For those of you, who feels generally they're not feeling anxiety right now? Okay, there's a few of you. What is wrong with you? Have you been paying attention? Global warming has us at the point where we are threatened as a species and our planet. I just read this article last month that really made it concrete for me in the New Yorker about the Lake of Chad in Africa that has decreased by 95%. The people who live around that lake are now in civil war. They're starving. A lot of them are dead. That I might be able to put that out of my mind and put it over here because that's such a faraway place. If it wasn't for the fact that the leaders that we seem to be putting forward are increasingly hate-filled, racist, authoritarian. This is the week that is the 1-year anniversary of Trump getting into office. Part of me goes, how the hell did he last a year? And part of me goes, has this only been a year? And, during this whole time, I feel like we're teetering on the edge of nuclear war that will be decided by two infantile, ignorant men who argue on Twitter about the effectiveness and the size of their nuclear button. Okay, now everyone, are we feeling a reasonable amount of anxiety as a show of hands? Okay, thank you. So I'm a journalist, first and foremost, turned entrepreneur in the last little while. And I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between media and anxiety. And on the 1st of January, when I was looking through my Facebook feed, which is filled with all of these articles that are 2017 in review that makes very clear that shit is really fucked up right now. And in between that, I see some of my most talented and passionate and smart friends posting, sort of looking back at this year and feeling pretty dark. There was a lot of that, and I don't know if you guys noticed that too. So this sort of societal anxiety that I'm going to talk about today, which is a little bit different than our own individual, it's felt by individuals, and there's a huge impact to that. And it's definitely, when I reflect on this, I really believe that it's in part a really reflection of the media system that we're currently living in. So one of the things when I was thinking about what I wanted to say to you all today, that I want to start from is an apology. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for my profession's contribution to how a lot of you are feeling right now. And I feel like we are undergoing a reckoning in my industry that I hope will lead to something a little bit better. And I hope to be somebody who is contributing to that. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. So the reality is that, I think 2 years ago, when I was earlier in this process of rethinking my practice as a journalist, I would have, when considering this problem, or this question, is anxiety good? Which, Nick brought up. Sometimes I think people in the creative field, I know myself as a writer, used to feel that I thrived on anxiety a little bit when that deadline was really hanging over my head. That's sometimes when my best work would happen. And I think looking at the sort of media environment and asking, is the anxiety that is being produced by this media environment, is that a good thing? I would have probably said no, and I would have probably said that I felt that the world that is being presented by the journalism and media that is being published is actually not reflecting an accurate view of the world. Yes, things are bad, but overall, kids are, infant mortality is down, starvation is down, there's actually less conflict. Things seem to be getting better. We seem to be able to have different conversations about gay rights, about transgendered rights, about some of these things. And yet the sort of picture that's put forward by journalism is very much one of crisis and conflict. I feel differently now about that, and I think I have a more nuanced view. That is, yes, the news cycle itself really fuels this anxiety and this view of the world that is conflict and crisis and all of that kind of thing. And but there's a lot of truth in that. Like, there's a lot to be concerned about, and that we should feel some reasonable amount of anxiety. But the reality is that the media system, the news media system that currently exists, which is, been shaped largely by the rise of social platforms and how we can reach people, and the change to digital advertising, which incentivizes journalists to get as many clicks as possible. It actually has meant that we've designed digital media, the system itself, to feed off of that anxiety, and as a result, we're feeding into it. So I think there's something ultimately broken about that incentive system that results. So in thinking about this problem, as a journalist, about whether anxiety is good, now I really feel in my own experience, my personal experience of anxiety and how it relates to my creativity and my work, that it is almost always a negative impact. That it impacts my ability to write and to tell stories, which is my primary thing I do. And but more importantly, it actually really impacts my long-term decision making and my strategic decision making, which is really important at this particular moment in my career where I'm moving into entrepreneurship, where entrepreneurship is my primary thing. It really clouds that. And so before Christmas, I was really in a place of anxiety, very, very busy with this big capital raise that Nick mentioned, and I felt like I was making decisions looking like this, like the anxiety had narrowed my vision like this. And I think the reason that I'm mentioning that is because I think that that really matters in the context of thinking about societal anxiety. Because we are actually facing the creative challenge of our lives with these big systemic problems that I opened with. And it's going to take all of the talent and creativity that people like you and everyone around the world have. And so we need to find a way not to get stuck in this lens that impacts our long-term strategic decision making. So how do we find the balance between feeling the anxiety that is reasonable, considering where we're at, and being able to have that, the sort of long-term decision making that we need to as a society to attack some of these problems? And sometimes it just shocks me how little urgency I see at the same time. We just kind of keep going to work, we keep watching Netflix, we just have twins, sure, that's a reasonable thing to do right now, right? We show up on Friday morning lectures, and these things are still unfolding, and it's hard to figure out how to deal with that. And I think that journalism and media's role is to help us make sense of that, help us make sense of our lives in that context. Yes, the world is really screwed up, and the primary role of journalism is to inform. We need to show that, but also how do we do that in a way that balances that anxiety with informing? That's one of the questions that has driven my work the last several years. So I step back and think about the biological purpose of anxiety. If we want to know how do we harness this energy to be productive, I think we look at that. And anxiety is related to the stress response, which is a very useful tool for human beings, because what that means is that when there's a threat in front of us, the stress response kicks our chemicals into gear such that we can interpret what we're seeing quicker, we can move quicker, we can jump faster, or we can jump higher, and that's been key to our survival as a species. So we need that as part of our existence in order to survive. But what I think is missing from allowing us to harness the positive part of stress response is that in order for that to be effective, we need release. And the media environment in which we're living doesn't allow for a lot of release. It's this constant feeling of anxiety that's coming at us from being constantly faced with the crisis, right? Everyone take a moment to look at the twins. Are we cool? We cool? All right, good. Yeah, so I used to be an education journalist, and I read a lot of research about the impact of stress on early childhood development. And we now know that having constant stress and not having release actually impacts our brain development. And kids who have been exposed to violence and uncertainty and instability during their early life often struggle with academic performance. They struggle with the ability to have patience and resilience and grit, and it actually impacts their long-term outcomes because of their decision making. So they're more likely to end up in jail, they're more likely to be unemployed, their income will be lower, all of those sorts of things. And I feel like that's actually kind of a useful way to wrap my head around what we're experiencing at a societal level right now. Like the child that grows up under stress, exposed to all of this, our society is sort of suspended in the state of mass trauma that has led us to sort of a paralysis and is preventing us from coming together to think and act and create strategically to solve these problems in the long term. So for the last 4 years, I've been obsessed with this question of what is journalism for? Like, what is media about? Like, what can we do? And so 4 years ago, I was a reporter reporting on education for some of the largest media outlets in Canada, and I'd done that for about 10 years. So I knew something about the education system, and it's a complex system. Why, what some of the infrastructure was that was leading to some of the challenges and all of that kind of thing. And I felt that like the work that I was producing, the articles that I was writing, weren't having an impact because I was simply just like feeding the beast and responding to the news cycle. So this news cycle, which is generally driven now by the PR industry. There's 4 public relations professionals for every journalist in this country right now. So, and not to say there's anything wrong with the PR profession, but that's out of balance in my view. So this is less being driven by journalistic inquiry and now being more driven by politics, corporate interests, and other sorts of interests. And I was just sort of constantly responding to that. And what I really wanted to be doing was helping people make sense of this insanity and do something about it. But my work didn't feel like it was doing that. So I started down this path of really thinking about, what is journalism for? What is the mission of journalism, and should we be rethinking that? And as I said before, the sort of long accepted mission of journalism is to observe, to inform. And for me at that moment in time, it wasn't good enough anymore. It wasn't good enough to say, here's the problem. So, I'm not so if I think about that through like the lens of a theory of change, and we don't talk about impact in journalism typically out front. We talk about it at award ceremonies. That's when we talk about it. And we say, oh yeah, we get celebrated for revealing some bad guy did something bad and they get fired, or having some policy change or something like that, which those things are good. That's all good. I want to do that. But the sort of theory of change that stems from that is that the reason that we're not solving these complex problems is because there's a bunch of bad guys that are kept keeping secrets, and that's it, right? So there's something missing there, and that's what's really driven my inquiry in the last while. So I quit my job, and with a number of other journalists, we formed this collective, a partnership, that was dedicated to experimenting with different ways of doing journalism through projects, with the goal of contributing in an active way to positive change. And really, for us, I think it's really been about like struggling with the balance between this responsibility to inform, and which often fuels outrage and anxiety, and giving people actionable ways forward and showing that, and how can we think about practice. So one of the things that I learned early in this process was that there's been a ton of innovation in the media space, in the news media industry, on platform. So what are the new digital ways that we can present newspapers and other forms of media, traditional forms of media? How can we, on devices themselves, how will we do this on mobile? How will we do this on iPad? On distribution, so what are the new ways that we can, algorithms, ways of writing headlines to maximize SEO potential, all of these things to get as many people to click on things as possible. And a lot of stuff like that, but there's been very little innovation on journalistic practice itself. And this is a really exciting area for me. So, and I was very inspired by some journalists at the New York Times, David Bornstein, who's a Canadian, who were part of the solutions journalism movement, and really thinking about new ways of making it more complete, and thinking about their theory of change. So we devoted our efforts to thinking about this. And And the one thing also that I learned was a lot of the innovation was driven by the business model. So that algorithm, that getting clicks, the sort of presentation, it was all driven by the need to support the shift towards digital advertising revenue. This is what was really disrupting things, was the shift from print to digital advertising. So what that meant was that the innovation wasn't actually that focused on creating something of value for you. It was focused on creating something that would capture your eyeballs so then I could sell your eyeballs to that guy. And that was my product, which really sort of messed up the whole system in my view. So in this process, we did some cool projects. We won some awards, and we failed miserably as business partners. My initial partners, I think they would agree. They're still my friends, thank God. But I really felt that there was something in this. Like I have this contention, and this is actually considered a fairly radical idea in my field, which blows my mind, that if we focused on creating a media product that was better, that created value for you, there could be a viable business in there, a profitable business. So when my partners and I decided to end our partnership, they went on to new things and continued to support our work. And I incorporated the company 2 years ago now with the goal of building a profitable business around this. And the reason that I did that was because I felt that if we could crack the nut on this in a business model that was scalable and replicable, then that could really have a large impact. There's a lot of nonprofit media outlets that have come out of this disruption as well, and they're doing amazing work. But for me, I felt that that was the sort of impact that I wanted to have, needed to be done through a business model. So here's my positive message. That I actually, 4 years ago, things seemed really dark. We're having tons of, and we're still in the the bottom of the bottom of what's been happening in the news media industry. We just lost 36 newspapers in December, and there's lots of more layoffs and newspaper closures to come. But I do feel that we're at really an exciting moment of inflection, and that is for three main reasons. So one of them is that technology has given us all of these different opportunities to interact with audiences in a new way, and to try to really create a product of value for them in a different way. And yet we haven't really taken those opportunities until now in our industry in a real way. And the reason is because we didn't really have to, because we still had this advertising business model propping us up. That is more or less dead. So in Canada, more than 80% of digital advertising revenue just went to Facebook and Google alone. That all used to support journalism. The classifieds business model, which was a huge part of it, used to be $350 million that supported the production of journalism, is completely gone. So we're at this point where it's not a luxury whether or not we use these awesome technological opportunities to connect with audiences in deeper ways. Now we have to, or we're dead. And I actually think that that's really great. I feel more hopeful about things because of that. I'm ready to create. I'm looking to see the space that we can now fill with better products. So that's one reason. Advertising's dead. This crisis of that Trump and many other factors have contributed to around fake news and trust and all these things have made it such that journalists. That journalism organizations really need to deal with the trust problem. We can't get away with just putting out misleading headlines to get you to click, and then you find out that actually that's not the article and it was quite misleading. So trust is the primary problem we need to solve for. And thirdly, with our business models failing, at the same time, there's this move towards digital subscriptions, where people are now much more willing to pay online for the content through subscription models, whether that's Spotify or Netflix, for the content that they really value. So that's really our only hope. That's that we can actually create something that is of high enough quality that people will pay for it. And we're starting to see that happen at lots of places. The New York Times is the one that we're really watching, that now gets more than 70% of its revenue from its audience and instead of advertisers. So they're a real industry leader. So for us, this has meant experimenting over the last 2 years, trying to figure it out, going through design processes, frankly, to see and iterating and testing and working and trying to develop a new model for Canada. There's lots of examples out there, but there's not a lot here. And I think we have some particular issues to deal with. So I just wanted to share with you some of what we've I'll go back to the slide, what we've landed on. And that is, these 3 values are the test that we have to put, our sniff test for any piece of work that we put out into the world, whether it's an article or an event or social media content. It needs to expose hidden truths. So that doesn't necessarily just mean sort of in the old investigative form, where we were toppling some hidden secret of a bad guy, although it can mean that, because we need that too. It can also be revealing perspectives that are hidden because of our national discourse. We're very dedicated to reconciliation, for example. It can mean revealing patterns in complex data. It can mean revealing information that is really important to the issues that we're considering, but is not getting communicated from academia. It can mean a lot of different things. Secondly, breaking down complexity. So we think that that's a way that we can really help people wrap their heads around things and make sense of the world so they can do something. And finally, giving them something that actually enables them to take action. And I'll talk to you about, I'll give you some specific examples of the work that make those a little bit more clear. But first, I just want to talk to you about like the machine itself, like how we're doing this and what our operating principles are, which is really where most of our innovation has been focused on changing practice. So this describes the sort of traditional way that journalism is often done. So if the x-axis is on the top, it's the journalist, and on the bottom, it's the audience or user, and the y-axis is the moment of publication. Usually, the way that we come up with our article ideas is in isolation from the audience. So I used to work at Maclean's, and every morning or every Monday we would have a story meeting, and you would come in and you pitch your best ideas. And my main test of those ideas was bouncing them off my friends at on weekend parties or whatever, and I pitched them to people like me, who kind of thought like me, who probably went through the same education that I did, who looked like me, and then we decided whether that was what you Canadians needed to know. Yeah. And then, once I had my story, I went along doing the reporting, writing, editing, all that kind of stuff in isolation from my audience. I waited till my piece was perfect. I pressed publish, and I moved on to the next story meeting, and I gave it to you guys to talk about it and decide if, to respond and react and take any action that might be a result from that, and I was not involved in that. So at Discourse, we believe that that leaves a lot of untapped potential. So we're thinking about all the time, how can we blow that up so that the ideas are surfacing from the community so that it's more relevant? And then once we have focused in on an idea that we think is actually responding to a community need that we've identified, how can we involve the community in reporting that to make it more accurate? And one of the really interesting things that's come out is in the audience research that I've read is the idea that the more that you know about a topic, the worse that you think that the media coverage of it is, which is like a huge missed opportunity, right? So I think about this as an education journalist. I worked at the Globe and Mail. I did it for like 10 years. And even at the end of that, I knew quite a bit about it, but I didn't know nearly as much as all of the teachers in my audience, right? And I'm not talking about crowdsourcing it. Like, there's definitely a place for journalistic practice and verification and using objectivity as a tool and like all of those things. But surely there was a way with all the technological tools that we have to make my work better, more accurate, and more relevant to their actual needs for information by involving that amazing brain trust of teachers in my audience. So that's what we're innovating. Then once this piece of work, whatever it happens to be, goes out into the world, we think that we have a responsibility to actively participate in the dialogue and the discourse and the following up of that story. Through, that might be, this means a lot of different things depending on the story, but that might mean discussing online, that might be doing events, that might mean working with the community to ask, okay, what do you need to actually take action on this? So the sort of main takeaway from this is we try to think of our business not as a media outlet, but as an engagement business. So our primary purpose isn't to produce content. Our primary purpose is to grow and nurture and serve a community, and journalism content should be the byproduct of successful community engagement. So that's a real different way of thinking about it for us, and it's been a hard process for us to wrap our heads around that. The guiding principle of all this is empathy. And it's about, I think another way to think about it, to put it in terms of creatives, is thinking about this as like human-centered design and bringing that to journalism, trying to understand what people really need and what they really want, and what we hope that the actual product of our process is work that people can really like get around. We talk about setting a table a lot. we should have work that is so trustworthy and relevant and accurate and balanced that anyone, depending on, can kind of like see something of value in it, and it becomes a jumping off point for dialogue. So even if you disagree on the politics, or you're across generational lines, or you come from really different ethnic backgrounds, you would hopefully be able to have a conversation from that. So that's one of the things that we're thinking about, which is like core to sort of our empathy principle. So I'll use a couple of examples. Oops. Yeah, so this is I've just pulled in some images from our reporter. So this is an image from our reporter, Brielle Morgan, who is a very inspiring reporter who's been focused on child welfare system for the last 18 months. And when she started in on this with questions about like why is our welfare, or why is the foster care system leading to all these outcomes that are really bad in BC, and why are we doing worse in other provinces and all that kind of stuff, she actually spent several months without producing any content, and instead engaging in like these really deep listening activities with kids who are in the system, advocates, people who studied the system, and government. And one of the reasons that she did that was because when she did some analysis of the media dialogue around this, she found that mostly what was covered was just when there was some crisis, some kid died, or and somebody needed to be blamed, and people would push for change. And because of this, there was a very, very hostile relationship between child welfare advocates who were representing these kids, and journalists, and government. And there was no conversation happening. And she was wondering, okay, what work can I do to actually get all those people in a room, because they ultimately just care about the kids, even if they are sort of in this system where they're attacking each other. So she started by hosting a series of listening workshops where she actually taught a lot of kids like basic audio skills that they could interview different people in the system. And then from that, she built a lot of trust. She started working on her work, and she produced content that, with actually asking some of those kids, or some of the young people, I should say, and they're not all kids, who were in the system or had recently aged out of the system, to work as sort of fixers with her. Fixers is a term that we use to talk about people that we work with in foreign countries that can help us really understand that country and access the people that we need to. So she was using people in the actual system to do that. And the work that she's producing is just amazing. So that, I think, really illustrates what we mean about revealing hidden truths. Because a result of her working in that way, she was able to understand things and get access to stories, to identify patterns that other journalists couldn't access just simply because of their relationship with that community was so fraught. The next example that I'll share is from Trevor Jang, who is a journalist from he's from Vancouver, but he lived for a period of time in Terrace and in northern BC. And he spent a lot of time reporting on land rights and resource development in northern British Columbia, which is a very polarized topic in these communities where there's a lot of proposed development deals, like the big Petronas deal that was just overturned a couple months ago for LNG. There's a lot of people and pressure from environmentalists to protect the land, pressure from indigenous groups, a lot of poverty and the need for economic development, and this led to a very polarized situation. So we sent him up there on assignment with no assignment at one point to literally just do an exercise in journalistic listening. He had a road trip that he publicized through this Facebook group and through other means to ask people just to come out and tell him, like, what is on your mind, like this kind of stuff, to surface stories. And on this Facebook group, he had done a lot of reporting on the subject already, so he was able to gather people on all sides of this debate in this Facebook group. And in the comments of his Facebook group, there was often people debating stuff, and it often got into like the same old like arguing about stuff that isn't actually helping us move forward. But he had this one story about these two people who met in the Facebook comments, and I'm just going to put it to you in his words. They both found themselves boxed into two extremes of for and against, yes and no middle ground. So that's these two people here. But this morning they met over coffee and got to know each other. So they actually met in the Facebook comments and said, you know what, let's just talk about shit. They found common ground. They both want a happy, healthy, wealthy North, and they just have different ideas about how to get there. They still disagree about LNG, and they have agreed to meet again to see if there are projects they can work on and support together. Since Shannon has relationships through Skeena Watershed Conservation Coalition, an environmental group, and Lucy has her company, Spirit Strategies, that focuses on community and stakeholder engagement, Aboriginal economic development and skills training, they actually will probably be able to accomplish something big together down the road. But for now, they're just gonna go horseback riding next weekend. So I just love that story. I just feel like, I feel like that is what we need to scale at Discourse. I'll give you one final example and then tie up. And that is around our third principle or value, which is about giving people the concrete things that they need to take action. So this is an image that was taken by an amazing Indigenous reporter, Wamish Hamilton, who is actually the only reporter in Canada whose full-time gig is reconciliation. I feel so humbled to be able to work with him every day. So he's a very interesting person because he describes himself as a journalist who happens to be Indigenous, and he's really challenged my ideas on reconciliation. And he doesn't see his role as amplifying Indigenous voices necessarily, but as finding his way into the really difficult places where this dialogue is clashing and where our value systems are clashing in order to contribute something positive so that we can actually have something better emerge out of this sort of history of colonialization than the colonial system or what existed before. So he's all about how do we find and identify the clash and take part in that and create space for it. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about reconciliation. So one of his things was he identified when talking to his community that there didn't seem to be, even though we've got more and more treaty nations in BC, a lot of these places are functioning as independent governments, there was no clarity at all around press freedoms in these places and whether journalists actually had the right to access freedom of information or citizens had the right to access information and data about how these governments were functioning. And this was something that was leading to a lot of disempowerment among communities, but also just slowing things down in a lot of ways for leaders as well. And he heard from people who were elected leaders in the system and community members and band members that they really wanted clarity. So that was his starting point for an investigation that dug into that issue for a broader audience. But he actually took the next step and created very simple guides for if you were a newly elected band official, exactly what is the interpretation of the Constitution and how does it relate, and what are best practices around media and all these things, very concrete, simple things that could help them do their work. And that might seem not a hugely crazy thing for a journalist to do, but it actually really is. We often don't think of it as our role to provide those concrete things to help people do something in a different way. So all of this work has all of this work and this through these projects and experimenting and learning has led us to the point where now we're 15 full-time staff in mostly in Vancouver, some in Toronto, and we've been developing what we think is a model that will contribute positively to the ecosystem here in Canada. So that's a new product that we're going to be launching in spring of next year. We do have a website where we're producing all this content and that, but that will be soon shutting down as we prepare to launch what is a very new product whose whole goal is to scale this community engagement practice and allow us to really focus on growing and nurturing that community and producing work that is more impactful because of it. As I mentioned, I've been deep in fundraising, which is a whole new world. And one of the pieces of the fundraising I just wanted to share with you as a piece of news that we did was we decided, we're a digital startup. We have some investors involved who come from that space, but we also really wanted to ensure that our community was at the center of our governance model and that they would hold us honest to these values, because media organizations aren't always very good at doing that. So we went out to the community and said, to our audience and said, look, we want you to become shareholders in Discourse and help us raise this $1 million that we need to take this and launch this new product and take this national. So we did that. It ended on December 22nd. We have 278 investors who came forward with $375,000, which was really amazing. So, and it's just this amazing group of everyone from like badass women and indigenous advocates to environmentalists to a Supreme Court judge to David Suzuki. I've never met him, that's cool. Yeah, so I just feel like we have this amazing group of people who are part of this community at the center of it that are really gonna help us succeed, who are owners in the business, so it's amazing. So just to go back to the original thesis about anxiety, and I've tried to share with you some of the ways that we're trying to think about media in a different way that is finding that balance. And personally for me, when Mark told me that the theme was anxiety, and I'm a person who's a relatively high stress, high anxiety person, and I thought, oh God, how am I gonna take that on? And to be honest, I'm so far away from figuring out balance and self-care and like I have nothing to offer you. I have nothing to say, so other than to express it. But one thing that I have felt like that has tied my career together. I used to be a musician. My degree's in jazz performance. And then I was a journalist, writing and creating articles and telling stories. And now I'm in this entrepreneurial phase. Is that like the one thing that seems to help my anxiety is acts of creation. So while I think this idea that anxiety is a positive and constructive fuel for creativity is not necessarily true, I do feel that creativity and the act of taking an idea and making it something real can be a real salve for anxiety, and that's what's really helped me. And for me, it's about like holding on to that and trying to keep my head above water has been a lot about thinking about some of the concepts that I learned in my music education, specifically from studying classical music, which is all about harmony and melody and counterpoint and release and tension and release and tension. And that's something that I tried to bring into my jazz improvisation, something that I've tried to bring into my writing and my narrative telling. And now that I'm in this entrepreneurial stage, I'm trying to bring that same release and tension pattern to my work, because I don't think that in order to try to make that stress response constructive rather than just bury me and lead to sort of the paralysis that I was talking about. So that's what I'm doing, and I'm gonna just keep on pouring my energy into building discourse, and I wanted to invite you all to join me on that journey. So as I mentioned, we're in the middle of designing and building out this new product. Actually, you guys are the very first people who are even seeing a glimpse of it with our new brand, The Discourse, and we are going to be, you're the first people that I'm also inviting to sign up to follow this, and I would love it, especially considering this particular audience of talented and creative people. It would be a huge benefit to us to have you as part of our beta testers and be among the first people who have access to seeing this new thing and giving us really critical feedback that I think will improve it a lot, and hopefully in the long term becoming a member of our organization. So you can sign up there. It's just a MailChimp sign up, and we'll just inform you when it's the closed beta is open and give you an invitation to join it. And that would be a huge benefit to us. And I also hope that contribution of building and creating with discourse could also be some small release and some small salve for your own existential anxiety. Thank you.
Who would like to ask Erin a question to get us going? Over here.
Hi, I'm Angelo, and this is lovely. It was so engaging. I have a question that I guess relates to my anxiety on media and news. And I work for in the technological field. I make video games. So one of the things that kind of worries me are the increasing power of the algorithms and the way that media gets pre-selected for us. And I don't know, like, on the other hand, I'm reaching a given age that I realize that maybe certain technologies worry me and they shouldn't, because it's change that always happen, and at a given point everything new seems scary, and for newer generation maybe it isn't, and they build they react to it in different ways. Mm-hmm. But the thing that I notice is that I think that even structurally, we are driving polarization because wherever you are on your political spectrum, chances are that you will get a constant feed of news and information that caters to your particular viewpoint. So here I'm probably like an extreme socialist. Back from where I come from, I'm like a moderate, but regardless, right? Like I can be, I don't know, a Trump advocate, I can be loving Sanders, whatever you want. I will get a constant stream of information that just caters to my worldview. Just say like, whatever you think, oh, you're right. And most of those things are actually not right because the world that we live in is increasingly complex. It's not something that you can explain in a headline. It takes time to really understand things, and it's time that we don't have. So we just go on Facebook, we have an headline that confirms what we already know, we are happy, it relieves some of our anxiety, but it also polarizes us, it creates those bubbles. Now, the question would be, do you agree with this? And how much does it worry you? Like,
Yeah.
is it a concern or am I paranoid?
Yeah, no, you're not paranoid. No, that concerns me a lot, and I'm glad that you had such a long question because I don't need to explain anything. That's great. What he said? But I can tell you a couple things that I know from this process I just went through, which is that your experience is very similar to people's digital consumption habits right now in Canada and in the States. We do tend to get most of our news no longer by going to the homepage of a single outlet, but from a variety of outlets, but through the endorsement of our social network. Therefore, it's already kind of gone through that one level of selection that would create those silos. So your experience is the experience right now. The second piece is that I've learned from the audience research process that I've just gone through is that people are really concerned about that, which I think is really promising. And because that's a problem that then we can go and solve for by building something, right? There is a lot of different things that are being built. I don't know, none of them work for me yet, but I do think that a lot of people are thinking about that problem. And at Discourse, we are thinking about that through our technology development, well, in two ways. One, through our tech development. So we're in the early stages of developing some AI features that I don't entirely understand, so forgive me. But with the main goal of essentially creating new algorithms that are intended to surprise you with perspectives that you wouldn't necessarily pick. Because that's one of the things that our audience is saying, I really need to know this. Like, our audience is like primarily between 20 and 40. We're the most diverse generation in Canada. We care about issues, we care about things. And we're the generation that is more aware of, I would argue, that we've sort of come through this like public awakening of understanding different perspectives, and we want media that reflects a lot of different things and challenges us, right? We know that the Globe and Mail doesn't necessarily reflect Canada in its full diversity. So so we're taking on that problem from a technology perspective, and we're also taking on that problem by being very, very committed to the diversity and inclusion in how we're building our organization and how we're hiring and who we're putting in leadership positions. And really, I'm trying to challenge myself with that all the time because I'm a product of the existing system. I know that, and I need to be very careful about that. So that's what we're trying, but we're not there yet. Yeah. Hi, sorry.
I'm Abby Wiseman. I've met once years ago. How's it going?
Yeah, there's so many people in the audience that,
Yeah. I had a question because I'm curious about, in a business model, how creating these kind of longer form stories that take months and months where somebody's not necessarily reporting for months and months on anything, how does that actually work? Like, how do you fund that and keep content coming?
Yeah, so we're basing our... that's a very good point. We're basing our business model on a combination of existing business models that are succeeding doing in-depth work. One of them is called Debt Correspondent, which is the most successful membership-funded digital media outlet in the world in the Netherlands. They have 60,000 paying members in a country half the size of Canada in terms of population. all sorts of homogeny issues there and a whole bunch of cultural stuff, so we don't need to get into that. But we have a research partnership with them where we're learning from them and figuring out how can we do that. And then adapting that for this market by also developing a number of other diverse revenue sources that are all trying to be aligned with our mission. I think the main thing that I've learned from talking to debt correspondent members in our research is that they actually don't care if their people are reporting every day. And I think that's like something that is, it's like this tick that is still like come out of us. I was a digital editor for a while at Maclean's, and it was like you needed to be feeding the beast all the time, and a lot of the content that we put out actually isn't creating value for anyone, and we're wasting a lot of resources because we're putting like 40 journalists all on the same story, and we're like producing the same product over and over again. So Discourse's bet is that we don't think we're going to be the only media outlet that our members want to consume content from. We know that there is a lot of options, but we don't want to be producing any easily replicable content that you can find elsewhere, because there's an oversupply of content right now. So instead, we think that people will pay to be members in our organization because we're only producing work after that serious, deep research, and it's of higher quality and more trustworthy and more relevant than what they can find elsewhere. So that's our bet, and we'll check back in 5 years.
I think that there's I'm Dan. Hi.
Hi, Dan.
I've just recently started learning a little bit more about the startup world. And I think that there's a really growing and really interesting and thriving model of building a startup and funding a startup that has to do with kind of what you've done. And that's sort of a wide scale sort of governance, maybe almost a co-op sort of understanding of how a business can be elevated by lots of people who care about it. But also investment into a company with shares is really complicated because there are all sort of barriers, like friends and family type situations versus accredited investors. So how did you side-skirt the sort of legal situations that stop lots of small investors into getting into a company?
Yeah, so we partnered with the platform Front Funder. Does anybody heard of Front Funder? Yeah. So they're a relatively new company. They're a startup themselves that is a platform specifically for this. So they have the regulatory and legal expertise and the system that is taking advantage of the relatively new regulations that allow for crowd financing. So we went through that process. It was very complicated. If anybody's thinking about doing it, call me. I have some lessons to share. Please don't go through the same pain I went through. But yeah, it's a relatively complicated thing to do, and we have good lawyers and spent quite a lot of money on them. So that's the answer. But when I think you're right. Like when we were going through the process of thinking, like we're trying to be super intentional. We want to do things really differently, and our financing mix and the incentives and the objectives that lined us up for also had to align with our mission. And it was from that place, and it didn't feel right to me to go this early in our development straight for that sort of venture tech capital, because I thought that would, particularly at this moment in time where we're only starting to see deals that are about that are not just like new plays and new innovations on advertising, but are about like serving audiences. Like it's very early in that space, and I want to be careful that our objectives are aligned with our capital. So that was our reason for doing that. But I do think that we are on this tech path as well, and that we can, we'll get there for sure. I think
We are over time, but I saw one hand over here.
Okay.
Is there anyone burning questions? Really? I have to go all the way back to the corner again.
Hey, Charles.
So your model is very innovative, and if you do succeed, there's really good argument for tax-funded media outlets to copy you. So if CBC decides to go down your path and copy your model, is that a good thing?
This reminds me of a conversation that we had on a subway several years ago. I haven't seen Charles in a long time, but I remember him asking me, what is your exit strategy? And I was like, ah. And he meant, what is your exit strategy for impact? Which is like, ah. The reason that we're doing it in a business model and isn't because that I want to make like a shitload of money. Oh, that'd be nice. That'd be cool. And that puts me in the position to decide what gets funded, which would be nice. Is because we do want it to be replicable. And if we come up with a technology that really can do this, then we think that that's something that's really scalable. If the CBC stole my ideas and they actually did it, that would be amazing. I'm not worried about that from what I know from their bureaucratic culture and a lot of their people who have come to me as refugees. I'm not too worried about that. But I mean, if the CBC actually really lived up to its public service mandate, I would be so stoked as a citizen of Canada. So like, let's keep pushing them to do that, hey?